Picture the most powerful man in America, not a politician, not a general, a man who built an empire from nothing but his own obsession and brilliance, a man who flew faster than anyone alive, a man who owned airlines, movie studios, casinos, and the attention of an entire nation. Now picture that same man, skeletal, trembling, barely 90 pounds, being carried onto a private jet in secret, in the middle of the night, because the people around him had finally realized he was dying. Picture him never waking up. Picture a coroner discovering needle tips broken off inside his arms, fingernails curled like claws, bones that had healed wrong from falls no doctor had ever been allowed to treat. That was Howard Hughes, one of the richest, most celebrated, most feared men of the 20th century. And the question that haunts his story, the question that this documentary is going to answer, is not how he rose. It is how, with everything in the world available to him, he managed to disappear entirely from it. The answer begins not with the darkness, but with the light, and not in Hollywood or Las Vegas or Washington. It begins in Houston, Texas, on Christmas Eve, 1905, in a family that smelled of ambition and money and fear all at once. Howard Robert Hughes Jr. was born into a household that had one foot in extraordinary success and another foot in something much harder to see. His father, Howard Hughes Sr., was the kind of man who changed industries. He had invented a revolutionary oil drill bit, a device with interlocking rotating cones that could chew through the hardest rock in the Earth's crust in ways that nothing before it could manage. Every major oil company in America wanted it. Every new well being drilled needed it. The family money was not inherited, not accidental. It was the product of a single brilliant invention that arrived at exactly the right moment in American history. And that detail matters, because Howard Jr. would inherit from his father not just the money, but the belief, the absolute unshakable belief that one person with the right idea could change the shape of the entire world. But there was another inheritance too, one far more complicated. His mother, Len Hughes, was a woman fighting a war that no one else could see. She was terrified of disease, not in the ordinary way that parents worry about childhood illness, but in a way that saturated every corner of their household. The early 20th century was a frightening time for parents. Polio was devastating families across America, cutting down children without warning or mercy. But Ellen's fear went beyond the rational. It lived in her hands, which she washed far more often than necessary. It lived in her eyes, which watched young Howard with an intensity that was equal parts love and terror. When neighborhood children came to play, she found reasons to send them away. When Howard reached for something in a public place, she was there before his fingers made contact, steering his hand away, warning him in a low and urgent voice about the invisible dangers that she seemed to see everywhere he could not. Imagine being 7 years old in that house. Imagine learning, before you could fully read, that the world outside was contaminated, that ordinary contact with ordinary things carried risk, that the safest place, the only truly safe place, was within the borders of the careful, controlled world your mother had constructed around you. The lesson wasn't spoken directly. It didn't need to be. It was lived. It was breathed. It settled into the boy's nervous system like weather settling into old bones. And yet, and this is the part that makes Howard Hughes so genuinely fascinating, none of that fear made him timid. It made him something far more complicated, because alongside the anxiety his mother planted in him grew something else entirely, an almost violent hunger to master the world, to understand how everything worked, to take it apart and put it back together better than he found it. By 12 years old, he had built his own radio transmitter. By 14, he was taking flying lessons on a biplane. The same mind that cataloged threats and dangers was also, simultaneously, incapable of accepting limits. You will see that contradiction running through every chapter of his life. It was never resolved. It only grew larger. And then the world took both his parents away before he was old enough to shave properly. His mother died first. She was 39, gone suddenly during a routine medical procedure when Howard was 16. The woman who had structured the entire emotional architecture of his childhood, gone. 2 years later, his father collapsed from a heart attack, gone too. Howard Hughes was 18 years old, an orphan, and the sole heir to a company worth tens of millions of dollars. The two people who had shaped him most were in the ground. The anxieties his mother had pressed into him would have no one to explain them, no one to moderate them. They were simply there, locked inside a brilliant, grieving, extremely wealthy young man who now answered to no one. Here is the moment most people miss when they tell the Howard Hughes story. They see the inheritance and they think, lucky boy. But watch what he actually does with it. His extended family expected him to hand over the company to experienced managers. He was 18. He had no formal business training. The sensible thing, the obvious thing, would have been to step aside and let adults run the operation while he collected the dividends. Instead, Hughes went to court. He used his minority share of the inheritance to challenge the family's control, to buy out his relatives, and to claim total ownership of the Hughes Tool Company for himself. It was a move that required legal shrewdness that most adults couldn't pull off. And when it was done, he didn't celebrate and go back to school. He looked at the company, confirmed that it was generating extraordinary cash, and then asked himself the question that would define everything that followed: what, exactly, do I want to do with a fortune? He chose Hollywood. Of course he did, because Howard Hughes was never going to choose the safe thing. He moved to Los Angeles in the mid-1920s with a checkbook, a pilot's license, and an absolute certainty that he could succeed at anything he decided to try. Most people who arrive in Hollywood with money get politely separated from it and sent back home. Hughes was different. He didn't want to invest in other people's visions. He wanted to make his own films with his own money, under his own complete creative control. The early films were modest, learning exercises. But then, and you need to understand the scale of this to feel what it meant, he decided to make a war film about aerial combat. Not a film that suggested aerial combat, a film that showed it in all its actual, terrifying, breathtaking reality. He called it Hell's Angels, and from the moment he began production, everyone around him began to understand that they were dealing with someone for whom the ordinary rules of filmmaking simply did not apply. He acquired a fleet of real World War I aircraft, dozens of them. He hired veteran stunt pilots. He demanded shots that required flying at speeds and angles that no Hollywood camera had ever attempted. When the early footage didn't look right to him, when the clouds in the sky weren't dramatic enough, he halted production and waited. Days became weeks. Weeks became months. The budget climbed to figures that made studio executives physically ill. Pilots died during filming, at least 3 of them, in crashes during aerial sequences that Hughes had designed specifically to capture images no one had ever captured before. Hughes himself was badly injured in one crash. He got back in the plane. But here, right here, in the middle of the Hells Angels production, watch closely, because the thing that made the film extraordinary was the exact same thing that would later make his life unlivable. He could not stop. He could not accept good enough. He could not allow anyone else to decide when something was finished. The pursuit of control, the pursuit of perfection, the absolute refusal to let the world be less than what he required of it. These qualities were producing genius in 1929. But the engine driving them was not genius. It was something older and more desperate than that, and it would not stay pointed outward forever. Hell's Angels premiered in 1930, and the world lost its mind. Critics had never seen aerial photography like it. Audiences sat in silence and then erupted. Hughes had done what everyone said couldn't be done, at a cost that everyone said was madness, in a way that everyone said proved he was either the most talented man in Hollywood or the most dangerous. They were right on both counts. He was 24 years old, and he had just made one of the most celebrated films of the era. The aviation obsession was always running underneath the filmmaking, running hot and deep, the way a river runs under desert rock. He had loved planes since childhood, and by the early 1930s he decided that Hollywood was not enough. He wanted to push aviation itself to places it had never been. He founded the Hughes Aircraft Company and began designing experimental aircraft with the same consuming focus he had brought to filmmaking. What followed was a series of achievements that belong less to biography than to mythology. In 1935, he climbed into the cockpit of his specially built H-1 racer on a dry lake bed in California and pushed the aircraft to a speed that no one in history had ever reached in level flight over 352 miles per hour. He didn't just break the record. he demolished it. The following year he flew from Los Angeles to New York in under 10 hours, shattering the transcontinental record. And then, in 1938, he planned something that the aviation world thought was reckless to the point of lunacy. He would fly around the entire planet, alone and at record speed. The takeoff from New York was barely noticed by the crowds below. But 91 hours later, when his plane touched down back in New York, having circled the globe in under 4 days, the city erupted in a celebration that rivaled anything that had come before. Ticker tape rained down from the office buildings above. The crowd was hundreds of thousands deep. Police struggled to hold back people who were pressing forward just to be near him. Howard Hughes stepped out of that plane looking exhausted and composed, and slightly separate from the madness around him, in the way that a man looks when he has already moved on inside his head to the next thing, while the world is still catching up to the last one. But even as the crowd roared, there were those close to him who had begun to notice something that the newspapers weren't reporting: the rituals. The specific, rigid, elaborate rituals that had quietly infiltrated his daily life and were growing more complex with each passing year. He washed his hands in a precise sequence, not once, not twice, but repeatedly, with a specific soap, in a specific way, for a specific duration. He wore gloves in situations where no one else would dream of wearing them. He instructed his staff to handle certain objects using paper towels, not bare hands, before bringing them to him. He had specific rules about food preparation, about room arrangement, about who was allowed to approach him and from which direction. His closest associates had quietly learned to accommodate these requirements, bending their behavior around his, the way people bend around furniture they've stopped noticing. At the time, they called it eccentricity. They told each other it was just how geniuses operated, and perhaps, if what was happening to him had stopped there, it might have remained manageable. But on July 7, 1946, everything changed. Hughes was flying a new reconnaissance aircraft, the XF-11, on a test flight over Los Angeles when the propeller system malfunctioned. The plane began to lose altitude over Beverly Hills. He tried to reach the golf course. He didn't make it. The aircraft tore through 3 residential houses, shearing off walls and exploding pipes and throwing debris across a quarter mile. When the dust settled, Howard Hughes lay in the burning wreckage, barely breathing. His chest was crushed. Ribs were broken. His left lung had collapsed. His heart had actually shifted position inside his body. He had burns across large portions of his skin. The emergency room doctors who received him in the first hours after the crash operated with the expectation that he would not survive. He survived, and the codeine they gave him for the pain, that was when the other countdown began. Because the pain from that crash never fully went away. His body had been rebuilt in a sense, but rebuilt wrong, in too much hurry, under too much trauma, with damage that the medicine of 1946 could reduce but not eliminate. The codeine helped, and then it helped less, and he needed more of it, and then he needed other things too. The dependency grew slowly and then suddenly, the way these things always do, until the pharmacological architecture of his daily existence had become something that his aides managed with the same careful attention they gave to his business affairs. But the drugs were only part of what changed after the crash. The deeper change was the one nobody could prescribe for. While he was recovering, confined to bed, unable to fly or film or build or negotiate, the obsessive-compulsive patterns that had always lived in him found unlimited space to expand. There was nothing to do but lie still. And when Howard Hughes lay still, his mind did not rest. It catalogued, it worried, it constructed systems. It assigned rules to every surface, every object, every person who entered the room. The anxiety that his mother had planted in him years before grew in that hospital room and those months of bed rest into something far larger than either of them could have imagined. He emerged from recovery looking different, moving differently, carrying something behind his eyes that his most trusted associates would describe, years later, in careful, uncomfortable language. He was more remote, harder to reach, more precise, not in the productive way that had produced Hell's Angels and world speed records, but in a demanding, exhausting way that wore down everyone around him and seemed to give him no pleasure at all. But here is what the world saw on the outside, and why the world kept looking away from what was really happening. In the late 1940s, Hughes acquired a controlling stake in RKO Pictures. He was building TWA into one of the world's most modern airline fleets. Hughes' aircraft was deep in government contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars. And when the United States Senate convened hearings in 1947 to investigate wartime defense contracts, specifically targeting Hughes, whom critics accused of taking government money and delivering nothing, he walked into that hearing room and fought back with a fury that electrified the country. The Spruce Goose was the centerpiece of the controversy. He had received enormous government funding to build a massive flying boat designed to transport troops across the Atlantic. The war had ended before the plane was finished. Senators called it a waste, called him a fraud, called him a war profiteer who had taken public money and built a monument to his own ego. Hughes declared, in front of the cameras and the senators and the reporters and the nation, that if the Spruce Goose failed to fly, he would leave America forever and never return. And then, in November of 1947, he climbed into the cockpit of that enormous wooden aircraft in Long Beach Harbor, this machine that engineers and critics had declared would never leave the water, and he taxied out across the harbor, pushed the throttle forward, and lifted the largest aircraft ever built into the air. He flew it for about a mile. About a minute, 70 feet above the water, low and slow and absolutely unmistakable. The crowd on the shore went silent and then erupted.
It moved.
Hughes had won. The newspapers declared him vindicated. The Senate backed down. The public, which had briefly been asked to see him as a villain, restored him to hero status almost overnight. But something had cracked underneath the victory, something that all the cheering in the world couldn't fix. Being publicly attacked had done something to him that physical plane crashes hadn't managed. The exposure, the scrutiny, the experience of having powerful people trying to dismantle the image he had spent his life building, it had revealed how deeply he needed to control the information that the world held about him. And from that point forward, the need for control stopped being mostly about planes and films and businesses. It became personal, architectural. He needed to control the distance between himself and the world. Through the early 1950s, the withdrawal began, not all at once. Gradually, the way water freezes, you can't point to the exact moment of change, but you look back and realize that somewhere between then and now, everything became solid. He stopped appearing in public, first rarely, then never. He began conducting his business empire entirely through intermediaries, aides, and assistants, who relayed his instructions outward and brought information back. He wrote lengthy handwritten notes that circulated through his organization like dispatches from a general who had retreated to a bunker. His rules multiplied. The paper towel protocols expanded to cover almost every surface in his environment. The hand-washing sequences became longer, more elaborate, more precisely specified. His instructions to staff about how to approach him, handle objects near him, prepare his food, these instructions grew to document length. The people close to him, many of them deeply devoted, many of them genuinely concerned, found themselves in an impossible position. Hughes was still, on paper, one of the most powerful businessmen in America. He was still signing checks, still making decisions that moved money in quantities that most governments couldn't match. Confronting him directly about his mental state meant confronting a man who held all the power. And so they accommodated, they adapted. They built their work lives around the architecture of his illness and told themselves that this was service, and maybe some of them were right. By 1958, he had checked himself into a bungalow at the Beverly Hills Hotel and stopped leaving. Not for a trip, not for a meeting. He stopped leaving for years. Imagine the room, curtains drawn against the Los Angeles sunlight, a projection screen set up against one wall, where Hughes watched films in continuous loops, the same films sometimes, rewound and watched again, the way a man might return to a piece of music that is doing something to his mind he can't quite explain. He sat in a specific chair. He wore almost nothing. The objects around him were positioned according to rules that only he fully understood. His food arrived prepared to written specifications that ran to multiple pages. He did not bathe, did not cut his hair, did not cut his nails, did not speak directly to anyone he didn't absolutely have to. The man who had flown around the world in 91 hours was now measuring his universe in feet. But even then, even in the bungalow, even in the darkened room, the money kept moving. In 1966, Hughes sold his TWA stock in one of the largest single transactions in American financial history, generating a windfall that would today be measured in billions. And then he did what made perfect sense to him and what made no sense to anyone else. He moved to Las Vegas. He checked into the Desert Inn casino, took over the top 2 floors, drew the curtains, and began replicating the bungalow world. When the casino management eventually asked him to vacate so they could accommodate paying guests for the holiday season, Hughes considered the problem from his darkened room and arrived at the cleanest possible solution. He bought the hotel. And then he kept buying. From his sealed suite at the top of the Desert Inn, through intermediaries, through phone calls made in the small hours of the morning, through handwritten notes that his aides carried down the elevator and out into the Las Vegas daylight, Howard Hughes acquired 6 casinos, multiple airports, a television station, vast tracts of Nevada desert, and various other properties. He was, by most technical definitions, conducting serious business. He was also, by any human definition, barely alive. Then, in 1971, the outside world forced its way in through one of the strangest episodes in American publishing history. A writer named Clifford Irving announced to the world that he had secretly met with Howard Hughes and conducted a series of extensive interviews, producing what he called the Billionaire's authorized autobiography. McGraw-Hill paid him a substantial advance. The announcement detonated across the media world like a bomb. Howard Hughes, who had not been seen publicly in years, who had become the great American ghost, had allegedly opened his life to a stranger? Hughes responded in the only way left to him. He arranged a telephone press conference. A small group of journalists who had known him in earlier years gathered in a hotel room in Los Angeles and listened as a voice came through the phone line, distant, thin, older than they remembered, but clearly his. He denied everything, flatly, specifically, firmly. The book was a fraud, the interviews were invented, and Irving had never come within 1,000 miles of him. Irving's fabrication was exposed and he was sent to prison. But the journalists who had been on that call were quiet about what they'd heard for a different reason. Not because of the fraud, because of the voice. The man who had once walked into Senate hearings and made senators flinch had sounded, on that call, like someone speaking from a great and exhausted distance. He had sounded, several of them said privately, like someone who was already leaving. He was leaving. The final years were a slow and terrible migration. Hotel to hotel, country to country. The Bahamas, Nicaragua, Vancouver, London, Mexico, always at the top of the building, always in the dark, always with the same small team of aides, who had long since stopped being employees and had become, in the absence of any other structure, something closer to caretakers. Joan Peters, the actress he had married in 1957, had endured the remoteness and the silence for over a decade before finally filing for divorce in 1971. She was patient in ways that deserve genuine admiration. But you cannot be a wife to a man who has ceased, in any functional sense, to be present. She left. He was alone now in the final and absolute way. Those who saw him in these last years, and the number was extremely small, described something almost impossible to reconcile with the photographs of the young aviator smiling beside his record-breaking planes. He was skeletal, his beard reached his chest, his fingernails had grown into long curving shapes that made it difficult for him to hold objects. He rarely spoke. His world had contracted to a set of rituals so specific and so consuming that they left almost no room for anything recognizable as living. He still issued instructions occasionally. He still technically controlled an empire, but the empire was running on its own momentum now, and the man at the center of it was barely a presence at all. On April 5, 1976, his aides made the decision they had been dreading for months. He was dying. They carried him onto a private jet in Acapulco, Mexico, bound for Houston, the city he had been born in 70 years before. He died somewhere in the air over Texas. The hospital never received him alive. The coroner's report, when it came, was a document that silenced the room. 93 pounds, severely malnourished, severely dehydrated, broken needle tips embedded in multiple sites in his arms, evidence of long untreated infections, bones healed incorrectly from falls that had never received proper medical attention. The systematic, comprehensive destruction of a body over decades by a mind that had long since lost the ability to protect it. And then came the final strange chapter that somehow seemed inevitable for a life like his. Howard Hughes died without a valid will, no clear documentation of his wishes, no organized plan for the billions of dollars he had spent his life accumulating. What followed was years of legal warfare, relatives appearing from distant branches of the family tree, former employees making claims, a gas station owner named Melvin DeMar producing a handwritten document that he claimed Hughes had left at a church office, supposedly signed by the billionaire himself as a thank you for a ride DeMar once gave him in the Nevada desert. The document was ruled a forgery after years of legal proceedings that gripped America the way only stories about money and mystery can. Eventually, the estate found its way in large part into the Howard Hughes Medical Institute, which became one of the largest private funders of biomedical research in the world. A man who had lived in terror of biological contamination left behind an institution dedicated to understanding biology. History has a complicated sense of humor. So now we are at the question the opening of this documentary promised to answer. How does a man like this, a man of this scale, this brilliance, this extraordinary and documented achievement, end up as he ended? Not as a metaphor, not as a symbol, but as a specific human being weighing 93 pounds in a coroner's examination room. The beginning of the answer lives in that Houston household, in a mother's hands washing the same surface twice, in a small boy watching and absorbing and learning before he had the language to name what he was learning. The fear of contamination, the need for control, the equation between safety and distance from an unreliable world. These things were pressed into Howard Hughes before he could choose otherwise. They were not his fault, but they were his. And then the rest of the answer lives in everything that followed, because the world never gave Howard Hughes a reason to face his fears. Every time his obsessions threatened to slow him down, his extraordinary abilities simply outran them. His genius was so large and so real that it gave him decades of permission to ignore what was happening underneath. He could afford, financially, to construct entire worlds around his pathology, to employ people to accommodate it, to build environments that removed the friction points his illness couldn't tolerate. He had every resource except the one that would actually have helped, the resource of someone saying, clearly and honestly and without their own financial interests in the balance, this is not genius, this is suffering, and you deserve better than this. Nobody said it. Not because they didn't care, some of them cared very much, but the architecture of wealth and power that surrounded him made the honest conversation almost impossible. His aides depended on him. His business partners needed him functional. The world outside found his mystery more entertaining than his pain. And so the illness was managed, accommodated, and enabled, until there was nothing left to manage. This is the lesson that Howard Hughes leaves behind, not in any simple bumper sticker form, but in the full and uncomfortable form that his actual life demonstrates. The things we bury inside ourselves do not disappear because we achieve extraordinary things. They do not dissolve in the face of success or wealth or fame. They grow, quietly and patiently, in whatever space we leave for them. And if we never face them, never find the language for them, never seek the kind of honest help that might bring them into the light, they will eventually grow large enough to fill every room. Howard Hughes filled rooms with his genius for decades. His films changed what cinema could be. His aviation achievements pushed the entire industry forward. His business instincts shaped industries that are still shaping the world today. He was, by any honest accounting, one of the most consequential private individuals of the 20th century. And then the thing he had been running from his entire life caught up with him. Not quickly, not with drama, just slowly, relentlessly, in the way that the truest and most inevitable things always arrive. The darkened rooms, the withering body, the mind consuming itself in rituals that once felt like protection and became in the end a different kind of prison entirely. He was born on Christmas Eve in Houston, Texas, to a family that smelled of ambition and anxiety in equal measure. He spent his life proving that limits were for other people. He died at 93 pounds in a private jet somewhere above the state that made him. History remembers the records he broke, the films he made, the casinos he bought, the mad, magnificent, incomprehensible scale of what he built. But perhaps what history should hold more carefully is this: he was a person, a frightened, gifted, complicated person, shaped by grief and anxiety and a mother's love that was also a kind of wound. He spent his life running faster than the wound could follow. In the end, the wound had nowhere else to go. And in the end, neither did he.